In this Elden Ring video, we're going to be talking about how to prepare for Shadow of the Erdtree, what you want to do with your character, if you want to create a new character, if you want to use an existing character before you go into the DLC. Let's get into why or why not you might want to start an NG+, why you might want to start with a new character, things you should probably do before you enter the DLC area. So we don't know too much about the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC itself, but we do know two very important pieces of information that can help us sort of prepare for that journey, sort of get our characters ready. So the first thing that we're pretty sure that we know at this point, that we're like 99%, it's not 100% sure, is that the entrance to the DLC will be in the Mohgwyn Palace. This is, of course, located after defeating Mohg, and we know this from the trailer effectively, showing the arm on the throne there, and also talking about touching it to go to the Shadow Realm. So we have a pretty good idea that this is going to be how you get into the DLC. And the second thing that we know is that the difficulty of the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC is roughly more or less the same as Endgame Elden Ring. And obviously the difficulty of that depends on what you classify as Endgame and Elden Ring, but to me, that means a similar difficulty to the Ashen Capital, to the Consecrated Snowfields, to Miquella's Hallowed Tree. We're probably talking a bit about the difficulty of those areas of the game if we're meaning Endgame. Crumbling Fair Missoula would also qualify. And Mohg is not an easy boss to defeat by any means, and essentially you can kind of tell if your build is ready to go to Shadow of the Erdtree or the Shadowlands if you can defeat Mohg. If your build can defeat Mohg, then you should be prepared for the difficulties and trials that await you going into the DLC. If you can't, then maybe you want to work on your build a bit. And in fact, the traditional way to get to Mohg is through the Consecrated Snowfield, which is one of the endgame areas of the game. So you wouldn't actually be facing him most of the time until very late into the game. You can, of course, do Vare's quest line and sort of jump ahead and get there very, very quickly in the game if you're so inclined with a lower level character with weaker gear, as long as you're a good enough player and can still beat Mohg because you know his movesets, etc. But Mohg is sort of sitting there as a gatekeeper to the DLC, and he's a way for you to check, essentially, if your character is strong enough to be able to handle the DLC. So those things being said, let's talk a bit about why you might want to go into the DLC later in the game instead of just rushing there on a brand new character. It's been a while for some people since they've played Elden Ring. The game is 2 years old at this point. Some people are excited from the DLC and they're playing now and these things are coming back to them. Some people started playing again over the winter holiday and they've been playing and getting excited. But a lot of people have not played in a good amount of time. So I just kind of want to refresh you on a few things that might help you make a decision about where the right point for you is to kind of go and tackle the DLC. So the first thing we're going to talk about is Talisman Slots. You have 4 Talisman Slots probably on most of your characters, but if you don't remember, these are not guaranteed. You only begin the game with 1, and you actually have to do certain things in order to unlock the other 3. So if you beeline it directly to the DLC with a fresh character, you will have 1 Talisman Slot, which might make endgame content kind of difficult to do. So the first way to get a Talisman Slot, fastest way, is to defeat Margit at the beginning of Stormvale Castle. This will give you 2 Talisman Slots. Highly recommend minimally doing this, at least if you want to beeline it there, because it's kind of on the way anyway. Takes a few minutes to do if you've played this game a lot, and you should be able to just get rid of them and get yourself an extra Talisman Slot. The second way is by acquiring 2 Great Runes and then speaking to Finger Reader Enya. This is longer to do because that means you essentially have to fight like 2 major bosses in the game, like Godric and Rennala, for instance, and then go meet Finger Reader Enya, and you will have a 3rd Talisman Slot. If you want to do that, you can. Highly recommend doing that, but that is a little bit more work than just getting that 2nd Talisman Slot. And the last Talisman Slot is unlocked from defeating Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, and Lendel Royal Capital. This is another boss fight. This is a good ways into the game, and it might be rather difficult to get to him if you don't have a pretty good build, but if you want 4 Talisman Slots, you minimally have to go that far before you go to the DLC. The next thing to consider is what talismans do you need for your build? Are you playing a mage type build? Do you need something like the Magic Scorpion Charm? That can take a while to get. Do you need something like Ritual Sword Talisman? You can go get that if you need it. There are a lot of talismans that might make your build really good, and they are spread all throughout the game, so this is going to vary from build to build, but you might want some specific talismans if you go into an endgame roughly equivalent difficult area. The next thing to consider is what weapons and armor your build is going to be. If you are been playing the game and you're familiar with the game and you know you have like a build that you like or a character that you like, if you're making a new character, then are you going to be strong enough with the weapons and armor that you can acquire quickly if you just beeline it there, or do you need to seek out the weapons and armor that you want for your build along with the talismans. That's something to consider. And then the next thing is simply, what character level would be ideal to go into there? If you just beeline for it, go to Vare, ride over there, do the quest line, defeat Mohg maybe with some help of some summons or something, and just kind of brute force your way in, you might be a very low character level and you might have a hard time completing the DLC content, particularly if you don't have all these other things, like if you don't have talisman slots. There's a point where it starts piling up on you, and all those things combined can make it rather difficult, where maybe if you had a high character level, the weapons and armor that you needed, but you didn't have the talisman slots, maybe you'd be fine. But you have all these things working against you if you just straight beeline it there. And then the next thing to consider is, do you have enough upgrade materials to upgrade the weapon that you're using to make it strong enough? And if you have upgraded it, do you have enough upgrade materials to upgrade anything you find in the DLC that you might potentially want to use? Getting the bell bearings from throughout the game can make it so you have an unlimited supply of a lot of the upgrade materials in the game. You won't have an unlimited supply of ancient dragon smithing stones and somber ancient dragon smithing stones, but even taking a weapon up to plus 24 or plus 9 is still viable at endgame most of the time. So do you need those bell bearings in order to upgrade the equipment? Are you going in there without them? These are things you should be asking yourself as well. And the last 2 bell bearings are found in Crumbling Fair Missoula, which is basically endgame Elden Ring. So that kind of reinforces the fact that, maybe you should go to endgame before you go in there. Obviously, it's going to vary from player to player depending on your skill level. But one thing that can help alleviate skill issues is having better equipment, more upgraded equipment. That can make it so you don't have to be as good of a player to complete the content. Another thing to take into consideration is, how many golden seeds have you acquired? How many flasks do you have for HP and FP? Have you upgraded them with sacred tears? Have you found enough of these to make them strong enough for what you're doing? That's another thing to factor in. Again, if you didn't have one of these things, you'd probably still be fine, or even a couple of these things. But if you beeline it straight there and you don't have any of these things, you're going to have a really rough time. And then the last thing is, like, Flask of Wondrous Physique. Do you have that? Do you have the crystal tears that you want for it? Is it going to be good enough to get you to where you want to go? And, this doesn't even factor in, do you have the spells that you need if you're playing a mage, the incantations that you need if you're playing like a cleric type build or something like that? Do you have the weapon skills that you need for the weapon that you want to use? That kind of falls under weapon and armor, but you get the idea. There's a lot of things that you could have that might make it difficult to make a brand new character and just beeline it there. And it's for that reason that I highly recommend you do one of 2 things. Firstly, you either take an existing character that's pretty far into the game, maybe it's defeated the end game boss, maybe it's 3/4 of the way through the game or 2/3 of the way through the game, and you're pretty comfortable with that build, you have good experience with that build. I would recommend taking that character into the DLC. Or what you could do is make a new character just before the DLC launches and go through the game again in like a new unit of time and play the game with whatever build that you enjoy, whatever build you want to play. We obviously have tons of builds ideas on this channel. Any of those or any other build that you like, definitely doesn't have to be my builds. But play that build, play a good ways through the game until you have at least 4 talisman slots, good amount of FP and HP flasks. You've upgraded them in decent ways. You have decent armor. You've upgraded your weapon most of the way. You have some upgrade materials and a bunch of bell bearings. You get the idea that you have a character that's fairly progressed through the game so that you can just go straight to the DLC when it happens and then go right into it. And you're not like, oh crap, my character is really underpowered. I can't beat any of the content. Or I wanted to start a brand new character and go straight into the DLC with it to experience the DLC with a brand new character, and now I can't get anywhere. So what I would recommend doing again is either take an existing character or play a new playthrough right before the DLC, like a week or 2 before, and get your character to a point where it has those things, and then go right into the DLC when it drops. There will, of course, be exceptions out there, speedrunners, pro players, people that know this game inside and out, that are the exception, that are going to make a character and beeline straight for the DLC with none of the things I recommended, and they will do fine because they're really, really good at the game. I am not one of those players. I think the majority of people playing this game are not one of those players. And for those reasons, those are the recommendations that I make for you. I feel like a lot of people have probably forgotten, because it's been a long time since they played, that, oh yeah, I collected all these things while I was playing, and if I don't have any of those things, my character is going to be very, very underpowered. And that doesn't even take into account like Spirit Ashes and whether you've upgraded them, gotten upgrade materials for those, and there's something that you rely on while you're playing. And the last thing I'll just briefly touch upon before wrapping up this video is whether you should go to New Game Plus or not to go into the DLC, or you should just play with your existing character. And I don't think it's super important what you do, really. The difficulty between New Game and New Game Plus isn't that substantial. However, From Software's DLCs tend to be harder than the base games in my experience. So if you were new to Elden Ring, like Elden Ring was your first Souls game or From Software game, probably be much better off going in your first playthrough rather than a subsequent playthrough. Secondly, there will be some things you won't have access to when you go to New Game Plus. For instance, if you didn't get all the bell bearings and turn them in, you won't have them in your next playthrough, which means you won't have access to upgrade materials that then could upgrade new equipment without having to go get those again. So if you are going to go into New Game Plus, make sure you get all the Smithing Stone miners bell bearings and the Somber Stone miners bell bearings, etc. But also keep in mind that Renala is the way to respec in this game. So maybe you find a weapon in the DLC area that you want to use, but you don't meet the stats for it because your build is completely different, but you want to respec and try it. If you haven't defeated Renala in your playthrough, you won't be able to respec until you do that. It doesn't take very long to get to Renala, but keep in mind that you probably already have access to that in your playthrough with your character right now, so that's something you also want to keep in mind. So those things being said, I think it's probably just easier to go in your current playthrough than go to New Game Plus. But if you went to New Game Plus, like really recently with your character, and you're wondering if that's fine, it's totally fine. Realistically, if you went to New Game Plus, you probably have a lot of these things unlocked anyway, and even if you don't, it won't take you very long to get them unlocked. So that wraps up our video on sort of how to prepare for the DLC. I hope I made a good case for why I don't think it's the greatest idea to just beeline to the Shadow of the Erdtree area, because you'll probably just get absolutely destroyed on a new character. However, if you have an existing character that's a good ways into the game, like probably halfway, 2/3 or better, you're probably fine going into the DLC regardless of, you don't have to have your flasks completely maxed out. You don't have to have them upgraded all the way in order to heal you the most or give you the most FP. You don't have to have every spell in the game. You don't have to have every crafting material, every upgrade material in the game unlocked. But if you have the vast majority of them, you have 4 talisman slots, etc., you have a good weapon, a good setup, you're probably going to be fine. And if you feel like doing a new playthrough right before the DLC or with the DLC, I recommend playing a bit earlier than the DLC so you can sort of play through, get the things that I mentioned, and then just go straight into the DLC the day it drops. So I hope you guys have learned something. I hope this was useful too, maybe reminded some of you players that haven't played in a while of what's important, what you actually unlocked in your character throughout the journey. Maybe you forgot some of these things and thought you had them all along the way. If you have other tips, things I forgot to mention to players they should absolutely get before they go to the DLC, let me know in the comments below.